Okay, so for my next little intro, part of the intro, I'm showing you a map. You can pause, fast forward, do whatever you need to do at this point. But hopefully this all helps you out and helps you provide some context. I'm not a history professor, but I do think that I can touch on some of the elements that I think will help at least in the context of what you're doing. This is a map basically of the different areas that we'll be talking about. The gets and purchase, as you can see, is right around this area. This is kind of the area that where you see my cursor is. That's kind of the area that we're talking about when we're dealing with this book. This whole area here, and as you can see, depending on the date, those different possessions shifted around, right? At one point, this is all Mexico, and as you can see, 1845, 1848, as the dominoes start falling here, that things change a lot in terms of the authority. I could put that in quotes because, once again, scare quotes, because as you may or may not be able to see, um, visually. I mean, I can show you the dates, but since the people that are involved in this book are involved with sort of carrying out the wishes of those in authority, whether directly or indirectly, this shifting authority really makes a big difference, right? Because sometimes, and I'll introduce you to that aspect right now. Before I get ahead of myself. The filibusters. One of the things to know about these guys is that they were known as filibusters at the time. And it's based on a historical group of people, an actual Glanton, who is a character in this book. He's fictionalized, but there was a real Glanton. And this gives you some insight into what this kind of group did. They were basically bounty hunters in a way, but bounty hunters in the fact that they were running around killing natives, okay, or Indians in the parlance of the book, and at the time. And if I slip into some of this language that there's some sensitivities involved, I totally understand that. Believe me. But I do need to stay consistent with the language in the book and the language of the time, because this is a very historically based novel. So there's really no way to avoid certain aspects. And as you start reading the book, you'll notice that that's not the only ugly aspect. Language is not the only ugly aspect of this. The history itself is very, very involved and ugly and violent, and there's a lot of things going on here. Most of them distasteful, but that is intentional. Okay, not me like sort of exploiting it or you thinking that it's exploitive. But one of the things about history that we do need to understand, I think, before I keep going any further, is that history is not as neat as people want to make it out to be. You guys are kind of fortunate in the fact that that history is sort of a lot more exposed now than it used to be. Meaning that there are narratives now that you are being introduced to about American history that don't necessarily fit the pretty little boxes that they were in, even up until fairly recently, even in my own youth. American history was sort of given this one story, right? That was one, that we were the good guys, and et cetera, et cetera, and that history only functioned along one particular narrative. Most of it, sad to say, the sort of white male narrative. And I choose those words very intentionally because there's really no way around saying that. And now that we're being introduced to different aspects of history and different voices within that history, we notice that not everybody had this neat little box that they could fit into in terms of historical understanding. And, fact is that when empires are built or countries are built, there's a lot of ugliness that happens. And one of the things to note about books like this is that they do introduce us to different aspects of history that are unsettling. And so I think our job is not to turn away from that. Okay. Believe however you want to believe about it, but we should not turn away from that. And as I've been talking, you've probably been looking at this and reading. Government of Chihuahua has made a bloody contract with the individual named Chevelle, stipulating that he could give him a bounty of so much per head for every Indian, bear, dead, or alive whom he may secure. Okay, these guys were running around. Okay, this is based on history. This Glanton was an actual person. Again, very fictionalized in the book. But I'll move on here to show you some of the aspects of the art at the time. My Confession was a memoir by one of these kinds of guys that ran around with the filibusters. And so some of the historical record in the book is actually taken directly from that. And I do have a video later that I may I'll probably upload for you guys when we get a little deeper into the book, because it does talk about plot points. So I don't want to give you that right away. There's lectures on this connection that we'll get into a little bit later. But My Confession was another historical text that McCarthy used to base some of the plot points and characters on. The next one, antebellum, meaning post-war or post-Civil War literature. Just to let you know, is that one of the things that we might want to do is start thinking about this in terms of how history at the time may be so unsettled that there wasn't any redeeming aspect of the American experience, except for maybe a bunch of violence and conquering and war and stuff like that. But one of the things to make note of is that there were some formative texts being written at the time, and some pretty heavy literary stuff. And one of the things that McCarthy takes advantage of is the fact that because of this, there is a rich literary history that was sort of contemporary to the events that were taking place within the book. And civil disobedience, although this doesn't have much to do with civil disobedience, it was a text that was highly literary at the time. But it was sort of a way of seeing civil discourse in a way that wasn't violent, right? Later on, nonviolent resistance was taken up by, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and so these threads of history were available at the time. Okay, so it wasn't just sort of, not everybody was just necessarily one-dimensional in terms of the times were not one-dimensional in terms of just racism and violence. These philosophies that later took root in the 20th and 21st century were there, were floating around. So take that as you will, so that you know that there is a deeper dimension to this. Okay, Moby Dick, which I won't get into too many parts of that, because that's really highly literary, and even though McCarthy makes some pretty specific connections to it, I won't necessarily go too deeply into that, because you guys, I'm not teaching you literary theory at this point, and that would be more of a 302, 303 kind of course. So just know that there are points in this book that touch on the idea of the literary history at the time. These are some of the other, and the top is a quote from the book itself. It's a reference to, it could be a reference to pretty much any of these, but Dante's Inferno, Milton's Paradise Lost, more specifically. These are some of the models and in terms of plot and language that McCarthy touched on throughout the book. Once again, you don't need to necessarily know a lot of this. If I do find some aspects of these particular texts in a particular plot point that I think can help illuminate things, I will definitely bring that up in perhaps a video lecture, or as I'm walking through some of these slides, kind of like I am now, with plot points that I think may be able to help you out. Okay, so this is another slide that I put up here fairly early to sort of let you know, if you haven't gone into the book yet, that the language is pretty thick. Okay, one of the things to make note of is that you will have to spend some time with the language at times, because it may wind up being a little bit confusing. And since this is, for most of you, probably all of you, this is your first go around with this, my expectations are not super high in terms of being able to hack through every single bit of language because the language does get very dense. Once again, I will remind you not to get frustrated with that. I am aware of that, and just sort of move through it in the best way that you can. Because the one thing you can do is you can be a reader. Okay, you don't have to be a classical literary theorist. You don't have to be a living, walking dictionary or thesaurus. But what you can be is a reader, is a good reader, and just be aware of if you do get confused with the language, just go with it. Just know exactly maybe where you may be a little bit confused so that you can bring it up later, perhaps, or maybe you may find ways to use my go once over of it, of the plot points and the ideas, to know, hey, that's the part that I had a problem with. So let me listen a little bit more carefully to this part, okay? That's what you can do. But the first step is just to be sincere and be honest and be open to the way the language works. So this right here would be the judge, one of the characters in the book, speaking. Okay, so if you can imagine, I'm not going to tell you too much about him, but he's a very bestial looking character. And he just sort of spouts off every now and again with these really highly literary ideas. It's a very strange, unusual character. So he would just sit there sort of in his sort of bestial mode and then say, "It is not necessary," he said, "that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history with or without their understanding." Okay, so that's the kind of thing that McCarthy does. Okay, he just has these guys spout off this stuff that is sort of not completely out of nowhere, but it's very lawyerly, educated language. And the judge is a lawyerly educated person, and it's easy to forget that because of the different aspects of his other character, which means that he's very violent and vicious and not at all a nice person. So we wouldn't necessarily think of that person as being highly intelligent and very reasonable, but in a strange twist, McCarthy does use that character to spout off some very dense lawyerly stuff. Okay, and then the last one is just a little quote that I'll leave you with from Moby Dick, because it touches on the judge who, if you've already read chapters 1 through 4, maybe, I don't know, or after you read chapters 1 through 4, you will know exactly who that is, because he comes in. I think you definitely have one good scene with him, and it comes in a flourish. Okay, so who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged to the bar? Okay. So, in other words, who judges the judge, in other words. Okay? So, hope that helps a little bit in terms of the context. Read. 100% understanding is not necessarily my goal, but an understanding of sort of where we're at as we start to discuss this, and each section of this book would be very helpful because it'll really sort of shortcut to the questions and form the questions in your own mind before I introduce you to all of the different elements that I have in my mind. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and I'll see you soon. All right, thank you.